Welcome to the Creative Penn podcast. I'm Joanna Penn, thriller author and creative entrepreneur, bringing you interviews, inspiration and information on writing, publishing options and marketing ideas for your book. You can find the episode show notes, your free author blueprint and lots more information at thecreativepenn.com, and that's Penn with a double N. And here's the show. Hello creatives, I'm Joanna Penn and this is episode number 465 of the podcast, and it is the 13th of December 2019 as I record this. So today I'm talking to Ken Atchity, who produced The Meg amongst many other films. And even if you don't like action movies, I think you'll really find this interesting. So Ken talks about how long it takes to go from book to screen. Of course, it's very variable, but sometimes it can take quite a long time. And we get into why loglines are so important for pitching. Now, this isn't just for when you want to pitch something for a film. It can be super useful in other ways. And this is one of my stumbling blocks for sure. The most successful authors are those who can hook a reader with a one-liner. And that one-liner can go all the way to the film. You can use it in advertising, other marketing, but it is a challenge. And I think it might even be more of a challenge if you're a discovery writer like me, because you might not know that up front. In fact, you probably don't. So we have a really interesting discussion, and you know, even in these big action movies, character is still super key. So that is coming up. So we're into the holiday season, so not much going on in terms of news. Obviously, in Britain this morning, we did wake up to a government, and we are going forward with Brexit, but it's unclear right now how that will impact publishing and authors and everything in general. So I'm not even going to comment on that, except to acknowledge that it's happened. So at some point, I will have some thoughts on how it might impact publishers and authors on this side of the pond. But in terms of other personal things, Productivity for Authors launched this week. Thank you to everyone who bought it and reviewed it. I always appreciate sales and reviews, just like any other author. It did hit a few bestseller lists on day one on Amazon, so thank you for that. And I'm getting some great feedback. Kristin Glassbergen says, I'm finding the new book so helpful. I have the audiobook and it's like Joanna is giving me a personal pep talk. So glad that's useful, Kristin. And of course, I did narrate the audiobook for Productivity for Authors. So you can go and get that also in every other possible format. I'm also, this week I've been like hard on writing the first draft of Audio for Authors, Audiobooks, Podcasting and Voice Technologies. It's on pre-order for second week of February 2020. It is now over 50,000 words. It's so funny. I keep thinking I'm done and then I'm like, oh, I must write about that. And it's very difficult. And I wrote a whole load, like a couple of thousand words, and then deleted it all, or didn't delete it, put it somewhere else, because for the voice technology section, I don't want to go too detailed on the technological side because, of course, this stuff changes so fast. I mean, really, it's moving rapidly. So I don't want to get too specific or too technical. I need to give kind of principles, but it's very difficult to give principles for voice technologies. So that is interesting. I mean, I realise that most authors are going to buy the book for the audiobooks and the podcasting sections, which are the bulk of the book. That's like 40k words on those topics. Turns out I know quite a lot about these things. I've been doing it so long. But I do want to give a taste of what's happening with voice. So very interesting. And I'm enjoying the writing a lot and feeling like this is a really good time for me to do this book. So that is on pre-order. I also, I don't know if I've talked about this, but basically, what happened to me at the end of October? So this isn't relevant for most authors, but if you're an author who uses content marketing, this might be interesting. And also just in general, having an online business. So I have had great organic traffic to the Creative Penn website, thecreativepenn.com, for years and years. I was one of the first websites talking about self-publishing and independent authors and stuff like that. And so I've benefited very much from the having a authority site, a lot of content. But what happened at the end of October is the Google BERT algorithm, BERT, You can look this up if you want, but the Google BERT algorithm update really, really has impacted my traffic. And this is fascinating. So I've obviously been going into this in great detail as to what's going on. And it's a bit like, when Amazon does an algorithm change or when Facebook changed. And, these things, if you see a big drop off, then it clearly is algorithm based. And mine was about a week after the update, it dramatically shifted. So, and this is very interesting for voice, which is why the timing of the book is quite good as well, because they've changed the algorithm to very much favour voice style searches. In the olden days, those of us who've grown up, who didn't grow up with the internet, who started using the internet later on, a lot of our search queries would only have been around basic search terms like self-publishing. And I've done very well with search terms like that. But what's happening now is very, very granular search, and Google is responding quite differently. So I'm not going to go into anything technical now, or even in the book, because it's not meant to be technical, but I will be doing quite a big redesign of the Creative Penn for 2020 and looking to do like a big spring clean. I mean, to be fair, I haven't cleaned up my website in a long time. I mean, I've had one site redesign in a decade, but I have not, for example, I've not cleaned up the back content stuff that's years and years old. I need to sort this out. So I know I need to do it, but it's not a task I had budgeted time for, especially over Christmas. But I'm actually quite excited. I started off being worried about it. Now I'm quite excited because I feel like, do you know what? Yeah, this needs to be done. And once I've done it, it's going to make my life a lot easier. And I wanted to bring that up. Two reasons. One, it might help you if you've had any kind of impact from Google BERT. But two, I think that this impacts authors in a lot of different ways in that. So say you've been around for a while, even a couple of years now, have a look at your books, your covers, your blurbs, your website. Is it up to date? Is it well designed for a user experience? Do you need to do some spring cleaning around your author business? And this is the type of thing to think about. I know that's kind of New Year stuff, but given that many people have a bit of holiday over Christmas, and if you have a bit of time to think, maybe have a look at your website and your books and everything from the perspective of the reader, and have a look as to whether there's anything you can do to do a bit of spring cleaning for 2020. Get more organised. The other thing that's very challenging, I was talking to a friend about this, is the idea of deletion. Now, with web traffic, you do a redirect, 301 redirect. So I can resurrect it if I want to, but this is content that I've spent a long time over for many years. But the idea of getting rid of it is so that you find better content. And I think this is a challenge around our books. So I have unpublished several of my books in the past. 3 or 4 of my books I have unpublished and they are disappeared. Now, for Kindle books, ebooks, you can disappear them forever, but print books are always around. So I have a few print books that I'm like, I kind of wish they weren't around anymore, but they are an iteration of myself. Like Career Change, the first edition of that, How to Enjoy Your Job or Find a New One. You can still find those secondhand copies. But I think the point is that we do need to address this idea of deletion and cleanup. And yes, having iterations of ourselves still around, but equally cleaning up things so we're showing the best version of ourselves. So that is what's going on in my head. I have parked my Map of the Impossible novel because this is a big deal for me and my business and my income. So I'm dealing with all that, and then I'll get back to fiction in 2020. So yeah, that's what's going on personally. So in useful stuff this week, I want to point you towards the new Writers Inc. podcast, and that's Inc. spelled I-N-K, with JD Barker and Jay Thorne. Obviously, Jay Thorne, all of you will know, hopefully as podcast listeners, Jay has lots of podcasts, but this one is with JD Barker. And in this first episode, it's really interesting. They talk about being a hybrid author, finding an agent who understands the indie world, and also about submitting something like loglines. Actually ties in really well to this episode of The Creative Penn, in that sometimes you can sell an idea before you write the book. And in fact, maybe that's the best way to do it. And super interesting, really resonates with the interview, because Ken talks about sitting across from someone and saying, here's a logline, what do you think? And the buyer might say, nah, not my thing. And then they'll be like, what else have you got? What else have you got? What else have you got? And so they're not going to sit there and read all your books. They just want to know what the idea is. So yeah, as much as that's difficult for us to hear, it's really good to think about. So yeah, check out the Writers Inc. podcast on your podcast app. And thanks for all your emails and tweets and comments this week. Kerry says, thank you for covering everything, Joanna. I can't ever find information for work-at-home parents who homeschool like myself. Your episode, Writing with a Family with Andrea Pearson, is so far inspirational. I homeschool 5 kids, and the last few years have been unproductive as I try and figure it all out again. Thanks, Kerry. So glad to help. Connor says, Kevin J. Anderson was amazing to listen to. It reminds us of the importance of learning and the need for multiple streams of income. Hello Tally says, I'm a quiet and shy fan. I love listening to your interviews. When a new one pops up, I know I'm in for a delicious treat. You've given me hours of invaluable data and a thrilling inside info about the author's life. Fantastic. Finally, oh yes, Jed, I want to give Jed a shout out. I love the idea of treating your books as employees. Jed also said that he only recently started to think about himself as an author after 3 years of writing and 6 books. He just still felt that he wasn't really an author. And then he wrote about a difficult health experience. And he said, when you feel compelled to use every experience to write books for entertainment and education, that has to be the moment to admit it. So that is fantastic, Jed. I'm so glad that you feel that. I know what you mean. I want to put everything into some kind of book, and that becomes part of the challenge of being a writer. It's like, okay, well, this happened, whether it was positive or negative or challenging, whatever. It's like, well, how do I use that to further my writing? Or how it's almost like we don't exist unless it's written down, which is kind of crazy. But yeah, there you go, the life of a writer. Right, today's show is sponsored by Draft2 Digital, and I will play a word from the lovely Kevin Tomlinson in a moment. Also, just to add that Draft2 Digital enables you to get into the various library systems for the pay-per-checkout model, which works really well for you and the library, and your book is free to readers. We've got to remember this. So the library model, you do get paid either for a sale or a checkout, and the call to action to readers is, you can get my books for free. Just go to the library and ask them to get them into the digital catalogue for ebooks and audiobooks. Now, Mark Lefebvre, who works at Draft2 Digital now, has just released a book called An Author's Guide to Working with Libraries and Bookstores. On my reading list, haven't read it yet, but Mark is fantastic. And I'm going to have him on next year to talk about his tips. I wanted to mention the book because it ties in to Draft2 Digital in that a very good reason for going wide with your books is to reach library patrons. You cannot reach library patrons if you are exclusive. So yeah, very exciting. A word from Kevin coming up. So this type of corporate sponsorship pays for the hosting, transcription and editing of the show, but my time is sponsored by my patrons. So thanks to everyone supporting the show on Patreon, especially at this time of year. I really appreciate it going into 2020. Which is just mad, year 11. So thanks to new patrons, E.A. Sandros, Tracy May Adair, Sarah Jane Weldon, Jen Carter, Emilio Karam and Stefan Doiper. I really appreciate your support on Patreon. Like the tweets and emails, it demonstrates you enjoy the show and find it useful and want it to continue. And you can support the show with just a couple of dollars a month and you'll get the extra monthly Q&A audio. Support the show at patreon.com, patreon.com/The Creative Penn. Right, here's a word from Kevin, and then we'll get on with the interview.
Hey, this is Kevin Tomlinson from Draft2 Digital. Discoverability is the key to author marketing success, but it's one of the toughest things about the business. How do readers find your work? Drafted Digital can help with that thanks to reading lists. Built around our universal book links, D2D reading lists let you create a bookshelf with customizable carousels crammed full of your books. They can be organized by series, release dates, themes, heck, even the color of your covers if you want. It's all up to you. You can also feature books by other authors, and just to make a little extra cash, you can include your affiliate links to Amazon, Barnes & Noble, Apple, Kobo, heck, even certain competitors who want to smash your words in a meat grinder. That's one of my favorites. Kevin Smash! You'll find reading lists and a whole bunch of other great promotion and marketing tools at books2read.com, powered by Drafted Digital. Go to books2read.com and discover discoverability for yourself.
Dr. Ken Atchity is an author, producer, literary manager, and editor. He and his story merchant companies have written and developed books, screenplays, and films for television and cinema. His books for authors include Tell Your Story to the World and Sell It for Millions, and his films include action-adventure thriller The Meg, which I personally loved. So welcome to the show, Ken.
Well, thank you so much. Thanks for having me. It's a pleasure to be with you.
Oh, no, this is very cool. So tell us first a little bit about you and your writing background and how you got into film and TV, because you have a bit more of a classical background, don't you?
I was a professor for years before I went into film and TV. And I taught, among other things, medieval English, and therefore, knew all about Bath and the Wife of Bath's Tale and Chaucer and so on. But I was primarily focused on Latin, Greek, and the Renaissance. And totally different from what I do now, although I'm developing several TV series in some of those areas, one on Sappho and one on the Roman Empress Theodora. That was completely different background, comparative literature, Yale PhD. And then one day I decided I just wanted to be on the other side of storytelling instead of analyzing and reviewing stories. I preferred my work developing stories with students and my own stories, and finally made the transition to being a literary manager producer.
And it's interesting because you make it sound so simple there, like to go from academia to Hollywood, whereas in my mind, and I'm sure many people listening, those are two very, very different worlds. So how did you have to change your entire mindset and the way you worked as well?
Well, that is a longer question than the way I answered it. I actually wrote a book about it called Quit Your Day Job and Live the Life of Your Dreams, because I was a tenured professor, and when my reaction to getting tenure after I think 10 years in academia was depression, because I really hadn't thought about what I was doing as being in a golden cage of security, and security has never been my primary value. My primary value has always just been creativity and freedom. And of course, security and freedom are both illusions, but freedom was my preferred illusion, where security was my father's preferred illusion. And I just decided that I needed to have a more daring life, and went into the world of commercial storytelling. They say the academic world is the world of ideas, and to some extent that's certainly true, but there's nothing like the world of ideas to compare with Hollywood. Here, Hollywood, we track ideas, we trap ideas, we buy and sell ideas for millions of dollars, and we hope to lure audiences all over the world to screens to see these ideas turned into, stories and movies. So it was quite an evolution. But it all began when I came up with an idea that ended up being 16 films, and that was my first project. It was called the Shades of Love Project, and it was love stories that I ended up shooting in Montreal and post-producing in Toronto, and we're distributed all over the world by Warner and by HBO, Cinemax, and I certainly had the bug by that time, and continued in this world where I find stories, develop stories, and sell stories, produce stories, and market them afterwards to make sure they try to get to the screens they should be in. The Meg being the biggest example, because we brought in $560 million worldwide so far, and hopefully we'll be doing a sequel next year, and it was quite exciting.
Yeah. And let's talk about the Meg, because when you emailed me and you mentioned it, I was like, yeah, I love that movie. And my regular listeners will know I'm such a fan of action adventure movies. I'm also a fan of Jason Statham. So I'm the perfect target market for that film. But then I looked more into it, and it looks like the Steve Alten book was published, 20 years ago, more than 20 years ago. So many people are interested in, many listeners would love, a film and TV deal. But what is the journey from a book like that to film, given that it's been so long?
Well, the journey looked like it was going to be real fast, because I virtually sold the film rights about the same time, within a couple of months of selling the book rights. And so I sold them to Disney, and Disney, the way big studios do, had it in what we call development hell for 3 years, which is nothing. But then it went into what's called turnaround, where the studio loses the rights to it because they haven't produced it yet. And then a few years later, I sold it again for over $1 million to another studio that took 3 years before they released it. And then years went by, and then it was finally sold to Warner Brothers, who by then owned the second studio that I had sold it to, New Line. And it went into development at Warner Brothers for years, until finally it all came together. And, by the time it hit the screen, it was 22 years after the first sale.
Mm.
And that's a kind of at the other end of the bell jar curve, because I've had movies move into production as quickly as 3 to 4 months. A movie called Joe Somebody with Tim Allen, but Meg was, as far as I'm concerned, is the longest it's taken any movie that I've been involved with.
It's interesting. I've actually spoken to a few writers recently and it has taken 20 years. So I was just thinking this 20 years thing is a big deal, but it's good to hear things can move more quickly. But most authors listening, including myself, obviously, we would love a film and TV deal, and we have lots of ideas. Most of us own our own IP. On this show, many of us are independent authors. And I noticed that Steve Alten had, a literary agent, traditional publishing, but have things changed now for independent authors and creators in this market?
Well, they've only changed for the better, in my opinion. There's pros and cons, but the biggest pro is that there are more channels and outlets for stories than ever before. And the good news is that many of those, the strongest of those, are now television, whereas 20 years ago, the strongest by far was film. Now everybody in film is trying to get into television, whereas before people in television were trying to get into film and weren't exactly welcome. The snobbery has reversed now, and TV is much more powerful because there's so many channels that they're all competing for programming. And of course, it's now going to another dimension with Amazon and Netflix becoming studios on their own and producing their own stories. So it's never been a better time for storytellers as far as placing stories. And the good news is they are likely to get more of the back end of a story than they ever would have in the past. But the bad news is they don't get paid as much up front as they used to because there's so many channels and because everybody is much more frugal in today's world than they were 20 years ago. Yet it couldn't be a better time for storytellers. We're always looking, my company, for example, for series, because that's kind of the home run, is to have a series of books that we can turn into as television series and sell to a major outlet like Starz or Netflix or Amazon or Hulu or Apple or Lifetime or any of the others that are out there. So I think it's a very exciting time for storytellers.
And then I guess having done a little bit of looking at this myself, pitching a TV series is very different to pitching a film. So if people are submitting to you and they want to, or you or other people, should they be addressing, writing a different kind of treatment, or, are people interested in actually just seeing books?
No, we have a hierarchy of things that we want to see from you. In fact, I give a webinar about that. But the first thing is we want to see a logline just by itself, basically, that pitches us, the story behind the series. The second thing we want to see, if we like the logline, we're going to ask to see a one-pager. And if we like the one-pager, we're going to ask to see a treatment for the series. And if we like the treatment, we're going to say, send us one of the books. That's basically a sequence of things that we need.
And the logline is something that I think many authors struggle with because, we're used to writing 50,000 words, 100,000 words, and then you want how many words? 50 words for a logline? So can you give us a couple of examples?
No, 50 words is more like a one-pager. A logline is, maybe 10 words is all we need. And what happens if the husband you adore needs to be a woman? There's a one-liner for the Danish girl. He was left behind on Mars. There's a one-liner for the Martian, right?
Right.
U.S. soldiers try to save their comrade stationed behind enemy lines, Saving Private Ryan. 4 teenage boys make a pact to have their virginity, to lose their virginity by prom night, American Pie, and so on. A logline is the way you would shout it out to a friend on the telephone if you only had a minute left and they were trying to decide where to go, what movie to see. It's the simplest and quickest way of talking about a movie. We had a great project once called the Kill Martin Club, and the one-liner was advertising mogul Martin Pickford gets murdered a lot. And, it's about a group of people who go to a nightclub at night and fantasize about ways of killing their boss. And, we sold that one to Warner Brothers. And, what happens when you're selling it to a Hollywood decision maker or check writer is that the final decision is going to come from their boss, and the boss is not going to read a screenplay, is not going to read a book, is maybe not going to read a one-pager. They're going to hear the logline, and they're going to immediately say to themselves, I can sell that to the marketing department. And it's the one-liner that the marketing department is using, to sell the movie. Like with the Meg, one of the wonderful ones that we used was, don't even think about going near the water. Another one was, the greatest predator in history is no longer history. So you can see how provocative a one-liner, needs to be. And my theory, as somebody who taught classical writing from the beginning of the times of Quintilian and Aristotle, going back to them, they called this one-liner that we're talking about, sententia was the Latin word for it. It was called the premise. And honestly, once you've written the first draft of a novel, there's no way to effectively edit your novel and revise it and make it ready without knowing what the premise of your novel is. If you don't know that premise, then you're not ready to revise, because what's going to result is not going to be focused and clear, to the reader. And so when people say, oh, I write 40,000 words, but I can't write a one-line description of it, I think something's wrong with that picture, because that 40,000 words is probably not something that is going to ever work in Hollywood, because it's going to take way too much deconstruction to turn it into a movie. whereas somebody with a clear premise has a much better chance of selling their story.
I think a lot of people will find that difficult because I feel like many writers, start with the story and don't come up with a short one-liner. But you're exactly right there. What I want to ask you then, particularly, is the difference between a logline that focuses on character over plot. Because every example really there, almost every example you gave was focused on character, even the one with the shark. Because in my mind, The Meg is not really a character movie. It's a shark movie. It's a monster movie. We don't care about the shark as such. We care about some of those characters, but it's not really that type of movie. So should we always be focused on character in a logline or plot?
Yeah, I mean, the answer is I don't agree with you that the shark is not a character. It is the character that inspired me when I first read the manuscript. The description of the Meg is what got Steve Alton, got me to want to represent this project. And when in that logline, the greatest predator in history is no longer history. I mean, that's entirely focused on character. So it's, I think you have to reshape your thinking a little bit about it, because that is the main thrust of a story. I mean, there are examples like The Perfect Storm, for example. The logline is almost the title itself. It's the coming together of three storms, that happen to be hitting the exact place on the compass, where the ship is, that is the focus of the movie. But the perfect storm is is really the main character of the movie when you think about it, right?
Yeah.
And so I think it's almost always about character. And one way or the other, you need to understand what your main character is doing. In order to focus your story. I mean, if you have a series that has 12 main characters and 60 characters, it probably isn't for television or the world of entertainment. It may be an indie. You may raise the money and make it yourself. But when you think about, The Fisher King or Snow Falling on Cedars or American Sniper or Runaway Bride or, Bridge of Spies, it all comes down, most of those come down to character.
Yeah, so absolutely. So the tip is that the logline should be character focused because, that's where the main conflict is. Even something like Game of Thrones, I guess, which is, like you said, mentioned 60 characters. I think that there's, a lot of them in Game of Thrones, but it's still a very character-based logline, I guess. I don't actually know what that would be, but I guess Game of Thrones is in itself a logline.
Yeah, exactly. And, think about Psycho or Sleepless in Seattle. These are all examples of, or one of my favorites, Liar, Liar. It's about an attorney who is forced to tell the truth. I mean, that's all about character, right? Or Bruce Almighty, another Jim Carrey movie where an ordinary guy suddenly becomes God. It's about that guy. What we love about stories is what would happen if a woman like this found her situation found her itself in a situation like that. Because if you can't relate to the main character, it's really hard to enlist audiences to spend their time watching that story. The Horse Whisperer. I mean, the greatest, I think, movies, that we remember are ones about a main character. It may be a massive main character, like War and Peace really is about war. That probably is the main character of Dostoevsky, Tolstoy's novel, right? But most of the time, the main character is a person or a horse or a dog. Like those are the stories that stick with us the most.
Great. So we now have our log line. What do we do with that? If we do we need to hunt out an agent, or should we? Because I've spoken to some people before, and the first response has been, "Why don't you get your literary agent to do this?" And I'm like, "Well, I'm an independent creator, so I don't use a literary agent for my publishing side. So should we be working with agents, or should we be going to festivals, or what should we be doing?"
Well, you should read my book, Sell Your Story to Hollywood, which is the subtitle is Writer's Pocket Guide to the Business of Show Business, because it shows you all of those things. But here's the problem. The problem is if you're not here in Hollywood, it's relatively dangerous to be pitching one-liners to anyone other than an agent, a representative. I'm a literary manager, so we count two, and attorneys two, and agents, all three in the same category of literary representative. And they're the safest way for your log line to be pitched. Because if you pitch it to a studio, first of all, the studios are going to be protecting themselves from getting random one-liners, right?
Yeah.
Because they'll refuse your email, and then when you get it bounced back to you, it'll even say this email was returned unread, because they are not willing to take any kind of liability for a random idea that comes across the threshold. We used to say transom in the world where there were transoms, but now that's long gone. But because they get so many ideas are virtually a dime a dozen. They're probably a dime for 1,000. What people want is the next step, which is a treatment, and at the very least, and what they really want is a novel. But the catch-22 is getting those novels into the hands of somebody who can read them, and that's where you have a representative who can help do that. And if I go to lunch, I go to lunch at least once or twice a week, and I pitch stories. I always start out with the one-liner for the story, because if my buyer, whether it's a financer or another producer or a director that I'm pitching to, if my buyer isn't interested in the one-liner, I'm wasting my breath pitching that story to them, with rare exceptions. So that's how you start, but you can most successfully do that if you're in the business. You're actually here, where you physically have a relationship that's been, going on for, in some cases, 30 years for me. They want to hear the one-liners that I give them, and then they want to say, what else do you have on it? I just got an email this morning from a major financer saying they loved what I'd sent them, which was basically a one-liner. What else do you have to send me? Do you have a script? Do you have this? Do you have that? You see what I mean? So that's why having a representative to Hollywood is important. We are living in the exciting internet world of getting your own stories out there. And if you're professional and do everything right, then you've got an enormous advantage you didn't have 10 years ago, when everything had to go through the gatekeepers of the traditional publishers in London and New York. But fortunately, we've passed by that. And, but the problem is that in the old days, 10,000 stories made their way around Hollywood every year. Now it's probably closer to 50,000 or 100,000, because 1 million books are being sold, being published every year instead of 50,000 or 100,000. Thanks to Amazon and the internet in general. It's so many stories floating around. It really helps you to have a representative. And one of the secrets I can tell you is that it may be hard to find an agent and hard to find a literary manager, but it isn't nearly as hard to find an attorney. And so if you look up in your directories and find an attorney who deals with entertainment, you can actually, meet that attorney by phone or in person and get them to represent you. And all that will cost you is an hourly fee, as opposed to hoping that he'll decide to do it on spec, or pro bono. But I urge people who can't find an agent or a manager to find an attorney. as locally if they can, but just make sure he has entertainment experience and credentials.
Yeah, no, that's fantastic. I've heard that from a lot of people. so that's really good.
Right.
Now, I did want to ask you about budgets, because I pitched a book at an agent, and he said, well, great idea, but that's going to cost like over $100 million. So why don't you write a low budget horror, because they're easy to get made. And I thought that was interesting, and I think I read in one of your books not to think about budget when you're writing a book. So what are your thoughts on that?
Well, that's a very good question, and I kind of understand what the agent told you, but that is based on the assumption that you are desperate to get produced, as opposed to the assumption of going for the gold ring, which is what I usually start out with for my clients. I want to go for the gold ring. I'm not the least bit interested in the word low budget, because Hollywood doesn't get nearly as excited about that as they do about $100 million plus budget. That gets people's attention more than anything else. Money is not an issue. It's always how good is this story, and how powerful are the roles of the protagonist and antagonist, and are they powerful enough to attract stars, because that's what makes the big movie work, is stars. So I would say it all depends on what your goals are. If your goal is to go for the moon, then I'd say write the high budget story. And if it's just to get produced because you think somehow that's going to make your life better, which it possibly will, then take the advice and write a low budget story. But I really hate to see writers guessing about budgets, because, for example, writing a low budget story that takes place in the Middle Ages, is not going to be a low budget movie. Even if there are only a few characters and this and that. So I just don't think that. I think the purpose of writing and the function of writers is vision and sharing their vision with the rest of us. And I really hate to see them trimming their own vision with, financial shears that they aren't necessarily going to be too good at doing.
And at the end of the day, I mean, you've got to write what you love. And I love big action adventure movies. I love big Hollywood and explosions and blowing up the Eiffel Tower. And, that's what I love to watch. So I'm always going to write books like that, which are big books. And people who love small literary, one room books, there was a movie about that, wasn't there? Room, I think it was. And, that's possible, but you've got to love that kind of writing, I guess.
Yeah, you have to love it. That's true. So hopefully you won't be writing anything you don't love. So
no, exactly.
I agree with you.
Life's too short. Absolutely. So I did also want to ask you, because I noticed that you've also written, obviously you've written some non-fiction books, which you've mentioned, but you've also written The Messiah Matrix, which attracted me because your blurb says for fans of Dan Brown and James Rollins, which is absolutely my target market. But I found a lot of these books seem to be cross-genre. So I wanted to ask you about cross-genre, because, many people find books harder to sell when they fit between genres and are not quite clear. So what are your thoughts on sort of these cross-genre niches, and should we be aiming for that, or should we be really aiming for very clear genre?
Well, again, that is a logical question based on the very opposite of what the creative world is based on. The creative world is based on thinking outside the box, and that is a question that is created by the box makers. And the box makers always love you to be focused on a genre. They don't like cross-genre because, frankly, they don't know where to put it in the bookstore. But fortunately, bookstores are not determining the future any longer. The internet is much less boxy, than bookstores are. So I don't really think that way. I just, if I got a book in front of me, which I do often, that is both a thriller and a romance, I'm going to make a decision of how to pitch that depending on who I'm talking to. And at the end of the day, if it gets made into a movie, it will probably be marketed as a as a thriller, for example, or as a romance, not as a cross-genre thing. Cross-genre is not a word that anybody really uses in the real world other than marketers. You know what I mean?
Mm.
It's not a creative world. So, in your Arcane series, for example, which is similar to the Messiah Matrix in some ways, I just see these as primarily thrillers. How do you see them?
Yeah, I see them as thrillers too. But I feel like much of that kind of Dan Brown, at one point they might have been called religious thrillers, but they're not Christian thrillers. So they kind of fall down a gap. But yeah, I agree with you. I think it's just thriller.
Yeah, and that's not really cross-genre. Cross-genre is when you have a sci-fi romance, for example. I'm having trouble selling the book right now that is a story about going back in time to save the life of a woman the guy's in love with. And I love the romantic part of the story more than I do the sci-fi part of the story. And unfortunately, when I send it out to traditional publishers, they're seeing it as sci-fi and they're not feeling the romance come through as strongly because it was subordinated to the other, genre.
Mm.
And so it's very hard to find a traditional market for a story like that. But if you made it into a movie and focused it on being a thriller, you wouldn't have a problem. People going out to watch the movie do not stop, at the pub after the movie and say, "Well, it was kind of cross-genre." Like nobody would say things like that who love the movie. That's only something that kind of academics say and that marketing gurus say and that people who put things in pigeonholes say.
Yeah, and I guess now, as independent authors and publishers, we have to put things in pigeonholes because we have to do the publishing. But I like that idea. I like the idea that we can break out of that. So we're almost out of time. Can you just, tell people what, because I went on your websites. You've got lots of websites and lots of books and lots of information for people to find out more. What is the best place, for people to come to and what will they find in terms of what you do?
Well, it took me a while to figure all this out because I realized over the years that I've been basically creating companies to respond to needs that I saw in the writing community. I've been working with writers my whole life. And so I have one company that is an editorial company and writes books for authors who really don't want to write. They just have a life or an idea. That's my oldest company, the Writer's Lifeline. And I have other companies that represent writers to traditional publishers. And I have a company that publishes writers who don't make it with traditional publishers, but I still need them to be books so I can sell them to Hollywood. And then I have a couple of production companies. But all of it is brought together in a website called storymerchant.com, where, on that landing page, you can see what the different companies do and which one might be best for you, and also see videos that I've done and interviews and books and so on. So storymerchant.com is the one-stop place to get to meet me and what we're up to. And it even has a place where you can tell us about your story, as an email, basically, right there on the site. So that, I hope, answers your questions. And I'm always happy to talk to writers. And one of my greatest joys as a professor was helping writers. And unfortunately, as a manager, I get to help one writer, but I actually don't spend as much time as I would like to talking to writers. And that's why I do podcasts and webinars and try to teach in that way, thanks to the internet and making it possible for all of us.
Well, this has been fantastic. And I know you've given everyone lots to think about. So thanks so much for your time, Ken. That was great.
Well, thank you, Joanne. I really appreciate it.
So I hope you found the interview with Ken really interesting today, and that it's given you some ideas about how you could make your book or books more pitchable. It certainly left me going, oh, I really do need to think about loglines. In an era of ever more content, it would be great to see more indies selling to the big TV and film markets. I know it is the goal of many of you, and me included. So next week, we are squarely in the holiday season. So I will be sharing some more personal stuff in the next few episodes. Next week will be a reflection on 2019 and the last decade for indie authors with me and Orna Ross. Then we're almost at my roundup for the year, and then my 2020 goal episode. And it's so funny because I've already rewritten those posts, because obviously I write the post first and then I record it. And I've rewritten it several times because things just keep changing and I keep changing my plans. So things are still in flux, but by the time these 2 weeks time, I will have sorted it out. So as we move into the peak of crazy holiday season, I hope you are finding a moment of calm and peace to reflect on your creative year. So happy writing, and I'll see you next time. Thanks for listening today. I hope you found it helpful. You might also like the backlist episodes and show notes available at thecreativepenn.com/podcast. You can also get your free author blueprint at thecreativepenn.com/blueprint. If you'd like to connect, you can tweet me at The Creative Penn or find me on Facebook at The Creative Penn. See you next time.